In this video, I quickly want to show you how I adjust and install a new clutch cable on the BMW R80. I need to adjust it because I'm running a new clutch lever, but I want to use the original clutch cable because it fits very nicely at the bottom. But for this setup, it is a little bit too long, and also the end cap doesn't fit into the adjustment screw. So we have to do three things. First, we need to shorten it. Then I have to turn a new end cap and also solder on a new nipple. So let's jump in. The first thing that we need to do is to determine where to cut it. And for that, it's important that you route it exactly the way like you want it to have. On the BMW, the cable hooks into this little arm at the bottom of the engine, runs along the engine through this bracket, along the frame, through this triangle, and then across over to the clutch lever. And then what I've done is I've unscrewed the adjustment screw so that I have play to both sides. Now it's just a matter of finding the sweet spot where it's not really under tension like this, but where it has a little bit of slack, not too much. And then I'm just gonna hold it, steer across, and see what happens. This is actually quite nice. So that is the routing that we're gonna choose. To know exactly where the bottom of the adjustment screw is, I've just used the small piece of a caliper, pushed this in here, and then marked that spot right there. With that, we can get a nice point for where we need to cut. To be able to cut the outer tube without actually cutting too much of the inner cable, we need to first take off the soldered nipple, and there's a special type of pliers for that that looks like this. And then we pull out the cable to the other side so that we have enough room up here to cut the outer tube. And for that, I'm just going to use an angle grinder with a regular cutoff disc. After cutting it, just make sure that you have a clean inside, and if not, then use a file or a pointy tool to get rid of any sharp edges. Now I'm quickly going to reinstall it just to double check that it's actually the correct length before I go through the trouble of making a new ferrule. I'm going to take a few more millimeters off because it's actually a little bit too long. Nice, now this runs exactly how I want it to run. So that is the perfect length. The next step is to adjust the end cap, and I was just at my friend's place whose lathe I was able to use, and he suggested to try to reuse the one that was on here, and they were great. So what I've done is I've drilled it back out to 6 millimeters because it was crimped onto the outer tube and a little bit smaller. And then I turned down the outer diameter to 9 millimeters. The whole process worked great. So here's the final end cap. And now the next step is to crimp it on here. I do have a big pair of crimping pliers that is normally used for battery terminals. So I want to try if that works. Also, while everything is still attached, we can quickly check how long the cable actually has to be. That actually looks like it's already perfect. It's like 2 millimeters too long, but we still have to bird cage this end, so I think we can keep it like that. Now these are the pliers. Up here you can change the size of the crimp. That actually worked great. Now we just need to solder on the fitting end nipple, and for that, have a look at your clutch lever assembly. In mine, there's something like this where the nipple hooks into. So we just need to solder on this trumpet nipple, and for that we first need to bird cage the end of this cable. For that I have fabricated a DIY bird caging tool, and that goes right here in the vise. This works for 1.5, 2 and 2.5 millimeter Bowden cables. If you want to see how you can make your own, I'm going to link you the video right up here. Don't forget to put on the nipple at this point, and then we trap the cable in the corresponding slot. Then we take the rod for the 2 millimeter wire. And there we go, bird cage done. After bird caging is actually the perfect time for last test fit because the nipple is already secured to the Bowden cable, and you can put everything on the bike like it will be in the final assembly. And I just noticed that there's a little bit too much play for my liking. So I'm gonna shorten the cable just by a tiny bit. Okay, so now we're ready to solder, and for that I'm going to use the honeypot method with my DIY self-made honeypot, which is just 2 M2 nuts that are fuse welded together onto this 80 by 80 millimeter square tubing. Underneath there I have a candle, which is enough heat to melt the solder, but if you're a little bit impatient, you can use the blowtorch in the beginning to give it a little bit more heat. Once that is liquid, we are going to dip the nipple into the liquid flux, and only dip the nipple because you don't want to get any of the flux onto the cable, because then the solder is also going to stick to the cable, and we want to prevent that. That is the whole point of using the honeypot method. So with that we can get going, and I would recommend you to wear some eye protection because sometimes the solder flies out and you don't want to get that in your eyes. The stuff that I use is called SN97AG3, and then straight away into the solder. For some reason, I don't get any solder to stick in the bird cage. It's very weird. The nipple is on here, but this technique did not work at first for me. I've tried it a few times and it never worked. So in my desperation, I went to a friend who's a pro at soldering and he soldered it on there, but with a different method where you would clamp the cable in the vise and then feed the solder in from the top. And I wanted to avoid that because a few things can happen. You could either overheat the wire. That I think wasn't the case, but then also solder can flow through the nipple and then onto the cable and make the cable much more rigid than it is supposed to be. But in my case, something even worse happened. I clamped the cable in like this and the nipple would be in the air basically, just held by the bird cage. And when he heated the nipple up and filled in the solder pushed the nipple down and the whole thing slid down like 2 centimeters onto the vise, spreading the solder all over the cable. That is something you definitely want to avoid. And because of that, I was like, I need to get this honeypot method to work because I can't imagine that it doesn't work with the trumpet nipples. So I've tried until I figured out how it works. I think my preparation was the problem. So a few things that I've done differently with this one that looks nice. I first carefully sanded the end of the wire with 400 grit sanding paper to roughen it up a little bit. Then I would put the end into acetone. Then I would take the nipple and roughen it up with a stainless steel wire brush. And after that, bend up some welding wire, put the nipple on there and also dip it in acetone. So I had 2 slightly rough surfaces that were absolutely clean. And then I did the same procedure like before, bird caged the end of the Bowden cable, dipped it into the flux and then into the hot solder, and it worked great. I was actually considering to redo everything, but I've just test fitted it and I don't think that in this particular case it's too bad because the Bowden cable is straight for the first few centimeters, so there's no extra stress on this particular point. It's unfortunate, but things happen and now you know how to do it properly. I'm gonna definitely do it this way the next time around. But now let's oil the Bowden cable before putting it back on the bike. And for that, there's this little tool. It's very inexpensive and that just goes onto the Bowden cable and then slides over the end cap and everything secures with this locking screw. At the top right here is a small hole that we use to spray in the Teflon spray. Then you just move the Bowden cable up and down a few times until it drips out the bottom. All right, with that being done, we can install it on the bike. But now we can see that I can't stretch the outer tube enough so that it actually hooks into the adjustment screw. So one little trick that we can do here is we just take out the clutch lever and then everything still fits. Now we just have to put this screw back in. Now the last thing that we need to do is to adjust the clutch play. This is a little bit too big. So we screw out the adjustment screw until we have a little bit of play, but not too much. Counter it. And there we go, clutch cable adjusted and installed. Apart from this little hiccup, I'm very happy with how it went and I hope you can learn from my little mistake and get the honeypot method right. If you want to check out any of the parts that I use for the BMW build sheet is linked down below, first link in the description. As always, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.